The woman had not eaten since morning, though there was still food in the apartment, not much, but enough, and she had left it there for Maya. That was not a decision she had made consciously. It was a calculation she had made without knowing she was making it. The way she made all such calculations now, quietly and without ceremony, in the narrow arithmetic of what remained. And still, when the old man stepped out of Marshall Foods with 2 grocery bags and a cane and a problem she could see coming from 6 steps away, the first thing Camille Brewster did was step forward. Before we get into it, leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. And if stories like this one move you, hit the subscribe button so you do not miss the next one. Because what is about to happen on this corner of 8th and Marshall has only just begun. East Cleveland in late November had a way of looking gray even when the sun was out. The kind of gray that settled into the bricks of the old apartment buildings, into the chain-link fences leaning at slow, defeated angles, into the faces of the people waiting at bus stops with their hands jammed deep into thin coats. The wind came off Lake Erie and cut through everything. It rattled the loose metal of street signs. It pushed empty plastic bags down the gutters in long, lazy somersaults. It found every gap in every jacket and reminded you that winter was not coming. Winter had already arrived and decided to stay. On a corner 2 blocks from the lake, where a small family-run grocery called Marshall Foods had been operating for 43 years, the wind was especially unkind. The door of the store opened and closed all afternoon with a soft electronic chmom that needed replacing, and each time it opened, a gust of cold air slipped in along with whoever was coming through. Camille Brewster stood on the sidewalk outside that door with both hands in her coat pockets. She was 34 years old, and for 7 years she had worked as a home health aide, the kind of work that asked you to be in someone's home before sunrise and to understand, each time you arrived, that the person inside was trusting you with the most private hours of their life. She had been good at it. She had been, if she was honest, better at it than almost anything else she had ever done. 3 weeks ago, the woman she cared for most recently, a quiet 81-year-old named Mrs. Grable, who had called Camille by her right name every single day. Not sweetie, not honey, not dear, her name had died. Quietly on a Tuesday afternoon with Camille sitting beside the bed the way she always sat. Since then, she had applied to 11 positions. She had heard back from 2. The second rejection had arrived that morning by email, while Maya was still eating breakfast. Camille had read it at the kitchen table and then set the phone face down and poured Maya's orange juice and said nothing about it. In her left coat pocket was a notice from her landlord. 3 days, it said, in the flat language landlords used when they had decided the conversation was finished. $43 remained in her bank account. The next paycheck, the last one, from the catering company that had let her go in October, would not clear for another 10 days. In her right coat pocket was a piece of paper Maya had pressed into her hand at the door that morning, before Camille dropped her at Mrs. Patterson's. Maya was 6 years old. She had drawn a heart in red crayon and written, in the large uneven letters of a child, still learning which way certain letters faced, "Mom, you're the best." Camille had not cried over the rejection. She had cried, briefly and quietly, before she started the car over the note. She was not planning to steal. She was not even planning to ask anyone for anything. She was standing outside Marshall Foods because going inside meant spending the $43, and spending the $43 meant the next 10 days became a problem she had not yet worked out how to carry. She was doing what she had learned to do when the ground started moving, standing very still and waiting for it to stop. The man who stepped out of Marshall Foods that afternoon did not look like a man who needed anything from anyone. He was tall, even slightly stooped, with a head of silver hair cut close and neat, and a long charcoal gray wool coat that was clearly expensive but old. The kind of coat bought once, decades ago, by someone who had decided a coat was a coat and saw no reason to buy another. He wore plain brown leather gloves and a scarf the color of dry oak leaves. In his right hand was a cane, dark wood with a warm brass handle, and in the crook of his left arm were 2 paper grocery bags, both full, one of them too full. The bottom of the outside bag had already begun to darken with a wet patch where something inside had started to leak, and the paper at the seam was beginning to soften in the way paper softens just before it gives up entirely. His name was Eugene Harmon. He was 78 years old, and there was a car waiting for him 6 blocks away in a gravel lot near the lake. A long, dark car with a driver named Wendell, who had been getting Eugene Harmon, where he needed to go for 22 years without complaint. Eugene had asked Wendell to park 6 blocks away because Eugene had always preferred to walk, not out of necessity, out of conviction. He believed that a man who stopped walking through the world at street level had stopped seeing it, and he had too much of his life still ahead of him to stop seeing it now. Camille saw the bag begin to fail before he did. She saw the soft paper give way along the bottom seam, just a small split at first, the way ice cracks on a pond before it really opens. She saw the old man shift his weight onto the cane, try to adjust his grip on both bags, and come up short. No one on the corner of 8th and Marshall slowed down. The wind moved through everyone, and everyone kept moving with it. Camille stopped. She crossed the 2 steps between them, with both hands already half raised, careful the way you approach something fragile that does not yet know it is about to be caught. "Sir," she said, "your bag is about to tear. Let me carry that for you." Eugene Harmon turned his head. His eyes were a pale, clear blue, the color of a sky that has been washed too many times, and they took a moment to find her face the way eyes do when they have spent a lifetime looking farther ahead than the distance between 2 people on a sidewalk. He looked at her. He looked at the bag. The seam at the bottom had widened, and a single orange was now pressed hard against the softening paper, one sharp corner from freedom. He made a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, but the sound a person makes when they have been caught between embarrassment and gratitude and have decided, in the half second between one and the other, to let the gratitude win. "Well," he said, his voice low and dry as a page turning, "I suppose you are right about that." Camille slid both arms under the failing bag before the bottom could give the rest of the way. She lifted and the weight pressed into her chest, heavier than it looked, and she had looked at it carefully and she did not let her face change. She had become very practiced at not letting her face change. "Thank you," Eugene said. He said it the way people say it when they have considered it first. Not the reflexive kind, not the punctuation kind, but the kind that means exactly what it says. "Where are you headed, sir?" "6 blocks east, near the lake. Car is waiting there." "Then let's walk," Camille said. They walked. The wind off Lake Erie came at them in long, flat gusts that found every gap in every collar, and reminded you, the way that particular wind always did, that it had no interest in what the afternoon had already cost you. Camille tucked her chin and kept moving. Beside her, Eugene planted his cane with the measured patience of a man who had long ago stopped being in a hurry and had made a quiet philosophy out of the decision. His pace was even. She matched it without thinking about matching it. They did not speak for the first 2 blocks. He did not seem to be the kind of man who filled silence for the sake of filling it, and she was not in the habit of filling silence for strangers. They passed a laundromat where the light spilled warm and yellow through the window, and the air through the vents smelled of soap and dryer sheets. They passed a man on a milk crate outside a corner store who nodded once at Eugene and once at Camille, as if he had been watching the 2 of them walk together every day of his life. After the 3rd block, Eugene spoke. "What is your name?" "Camille. Camille Broussard." He repeated it slowly, not performing the act of listening, but actually doing it the way a person tastes a word to make sure they have it right. "Camille Broussard." A pause. "Where are you from originally, not Cleveland?" "Birmingham," she said. "I came up 9 years ago. My daughter was born here. It is her city more than mine now." He nodded once. He let the answer sit for the full length of a block before he asked anything else. That was the thing she would notice later, that he never rushed from one question to the next, never asked a follow-up before the first one had finished settling. He seemed to understand that a question asked too quickly after the last one was not really a question at all. It was just noise. After another block, he said, "Is there anyone expecting you for supper this evening?" The question was gentle enough that she almost did not feel the edge of it. She looked at him, the long gray coat, the brass-handled cane, the patient blue eyes, and she understood, in the way you understand certain things before you have the words for them, that he already knew the shape of the answer. Not the details, just the shape. "My daughter is at the neighbor's," Camille said. "She is fine. But I told Mrs. Patterson I would be back before 5. He nodded. He did not ask who Mrs. Patterson was or why Maya was there on a Tuesday afternoon instead of home. He absorbed the answer the way the ground absorbs rain and kept moving, which was, she thought, the right thing to do with it. They turned onto a wider block where the buildings thinned out and the cold smell of the lake grew stronger. That particular smell of November water and wet stone that anyone who has lived near Lake Erie carries in them for the rest of their life. Camille shifted the bag slightly in her arms, feeling the orange move inside it, finding a new center. Then the cane caught a ridge, one of the long sidewalk splits that appear so gradually you stop seeing them. Eugene compensated quickly, but the shift traveled up through his arm and into the bag he was still carrying, and the orange that had been working toward freedom since the corner of Marshall finally made its decision. It dropped. Camille caught it with her right hand, one-handed, without setting down the bag she was already carrying, without adjusting her stride. She pressed the orange against her side with her elbow, tucked it back into the top of Eugene's bag, and kept walking. "There it is," she said. He did not say anything. He looked at her right hand, at the ease of the catch, at the fact that she had not broken stride. for a moment longer than the moment required. Then he looked at the sidewalk ahead and kept going. 2 blocks from the lake, the street widened and Camille saw the car. She had not expected a car like that. Long, very dark, the kind that in this part of East Cleveland appeared outside courthouses and funeral homes and nowhere else in particular. It sat in a small gravel beside a closed bait shop. A man in a dark coat and a driver's cap stood beside it, hands clasped in front of him, watching the street with the still attentiveness of someone for whom waiting had long ago become something other than waiting. Something in Camille's step recalibrated, not fear, something more precise than fear. "That is just Wendell," Eugene said quietly and almost apologetically. "He has been driving me for 22 years. He will not crowd you." Wendell saw them coming from half a block away. He did not move toward them. He straightened, and something small and unhurried settled in the corners of his eyes. Not surprise, not curiosity. Something older and steadier than either. He had worked for Eugene Harmon long enough to know that the man rarely returned to the car the same way he had left it. When they reached the gravel lot, Wendell lifted his mef cap briefly. "Mrs. Broussard," he said. "Not ma'am, not miss, not hey there or nothing at all. Miss Broussard," with the full measure of the correct form of address delivered as if it were the minimum any person was owed, and he had every intention of paying it. Camille had been called a great many things across 7 years of home health work. "Han, sweetie, you," by people who never learned her name because they had decided they did not need to. Hearing her name said this way, plainly and completely, by a man she had never met, landed somewhere in her chest with a weight she had not anticipated. "Thank you for your help," he said, and took the torn bag from her arms with the careful hands of someone who knew how to receive something that had been carried a long distance. Eugene reached into the inside pocket of his long gray coat. Camille felt a familiar tightening, the small reflex that comes from having been without money long enough to develop opinions about the moments when it might appear. She took one small step back. "I didn't do it for money, sir." Her voice was quiet, but entirely clear. "I did it because the bag was about to break." Eugene's hand stopped inside his coat. He looked at her for a long moment, really looked, the way he looked at things for 78 years, twice before deciding what they were. Then something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but was close to frost, the way the first gray of morning is close to sunrise. "I know you didn't," he said. "I'm reaching for something else." What he produced was a card, small, heavy paper, white. He held it out between 2 gloved fingers. On it, in plain black type, no logo, no company, no title, just a name and a telephone number, Eugene J. Harmon. The back was blank. "This number rings to a woman named Naomi," he said. "She has managed my household for 30 years. She is a grandmother 7 times over, and she is kinder than I am, which is saying something." He paused. "If you ever find yourself in a situation where you need someone in your corner, you do not need to explain anything. You only say, 'This is Camille. I met Mr. Harmon outside the store on 8th and Marshall.' Naomi will know what to do." Camille took the card. The paper was smooth and cool between her fingers. She turned it over once. The back was blank, just as she had thought. She put it in her right coat pocket, the same pocket where she kept Maya's note. The card was stiff and exact. The note was soft and imprecise. They settled against each other in the dark of the pocket, one almost exactly the size of the other. Eugene held the rear door of the car open before Wubble could reach it. "There is a restaurant on Larchmere Boulevard," he said. "The owner is a friend of mine. Her name is Sylvia. The food is simple and very good, and she has a telephone you may use to call your neighbor and make sure Maya is all right. I would be glad of the company if you would join me." He paused. "You are not obligated. Wendell will take you wherever you ask him to go." Camille looked at the card. She thought about the $43. She thought about the thickening dark and the temperature still falling. She thought about Maya at Mrs. Patterson's fine, eating crackers, asking every 10 minutes when Mama was coming back. "All right," she said. "Thank you, sir." She got into a seat and called Mrs. Patterson from a car that smelled of clean leather and old wool. Maya was fine. No rush. She put the phone away and watched East Cleveland move past the window as Wendell pulled out of the lot and headed south. The drive to Lartmere took about 15 minutes. They left the gray streets near the lake and moved south through neighborhoods that Camille knew only from bus windows, the houses growing larger, the trees thicker, the sidewalks wider and better lit. She watched it all without saying anything. Eugene looked out his own window with the expression of a man who had seen these same streets 100 times and still found something in them worth looking at. Wendell drove without comment, which Camille was beginning to understand was simply how Wendell drove. Larchmere Boulevard was a long street of old brick storefronts and bare-limbed trees whose roots had been lifting the sidewalk pavement for decades, without anyone deciding to do much about it. The restaurant was midway down the block, between an antique bookstore with its gate half pulled and a tailor's shop with a single light burning in the back. Its name was painted in modest gold letters on the front window, Sylvia's. Below the name, in smaller script, Est, 1987. The Ode in Sylvia's had a small five-pointed star beside it that someone had added a long time ago and which no one had explained or removed. Inside was the smell of bread. Not the flat commercial smell of bread from a bag, but the deep, round smell of bread that has been doing something slow and serious in a hot oven for hours. The kind of smell that reaches you before you have fully stepped through the door and does something to your shoulders without asking permission. There were 12 tables in the whole room, each one covered in plain white cloth, each one set with simple white plates and silverware that looked as if it had been polished by hand rather than machine. The walls were painted the soft yellow of butter, left out on a counter in the morning. Old photographs in mismatched frames lined the walls, a younger woman in a kitchen, a man in an apron holding something triumphant at a lakeside, two children on a beach somewhere far and warm. A woman in her mid-60s came through a swinging door at the back, wiping her hands on a clean white towel. She was broad-shouldered and unhurried, with silver hair cut short, and a face that had spent decades in kitchens, and had taken on the particular calm of someone who'd been feeding people through everything life had asked of them, and had found the work sufficient. When she saw Eugene standing in the doorway, her whole face rearranged itself around something that was not quite relief and not quite joy but lived between them. She crossed the room and took both his hands. Eugene, she said, 3 weeks, you know better than that. I know, Sylvia, forgive me. The doctor should find something else to do with their time, she said. But she was smiling when she said it. Then she turned to Camille. She did not lower her voice. She did not soften her expression into something patronized, manage her face into the particular shape adults made when they were being careful with someone they assumed was fragile. She looked at Camille the same way she had looked at Eugene, directly, with the full measure of her attention, as if this were simply the minimum courtesy owed to any person who walked through her door and had not yet done anything to deserve less. I'm Sylvia, she said. This is my restaurant. You are very welcome here. Camille Broussard, Camille said. Thank you. Sylvia nodded once, the nod of a woman who had been running a dining room long enough to know exactly which guests needed to be drawn out and which simply needed to be left to themselves, and she led them to a table near the front window, where the last of the afternoon light came through the glass at a low angle and lay across the white cloth like something the day had left behind on its way out. A few minutes later, Sylvia herself brought the bread basket to the table, not a young woman in an apron. Sylvia herself, with a basket of small round loaves still warm from the oven, the crusts a deep and even brown, a small dish of butter beside them on the cloth. Eugene reached for the basket and pushed it gently toward the middle of the table. Eat as much as you like, he said. She will keep bringing it. That is how she is. Camille reached for one of the rolls. She did not take it right away. She turned it over in her palm first, pressed the bottom with her thumb to test the give, held it close enough to distinguish the smell of the crust from the smell of the crumb. 7 years of home health work had given her time in a great many kitchens, heating things, preparing things, learning by proximity, and she had been paying attention the entire time. Did she bake these today? She asked. She bakes every afternoon, Eugene said. Has for 37 years. Camille set the roll down and looked toward the kitchen. When Sylvia came back through the swinging door a minute later to check on the table, Camille said, "What temperature?" Sylvia stopped. She looked at Camille properly for the second time. She told her the number. That is why the crust holds without drying the crumb, Camille said. Most people go hotter and pull it too soon. The inside never finishes properly. Sylvia looked at her for a long moment, the look of someone who has just received accurate information from a person they had not expected to have it. Then she looked at Eugene. Eugene was looking at his coffee cup. He was not smiling, but the geography of his face had made a small, quiet adjustment. Come back on a Saturday, Sylvia said to Camille. I'll show you what I do with the rye. Then she went back through the swinging door. Camille ate with the careful restraint of someone who had learned, in circumstances she did not discuss, how not to show hunger in front of people she did not know well. She ate steadily and without rushing and kept her eyes on the tablecloth more than on the plate. Eugene did not watch her eat. He turned his face toward the window and looked out at Larchmere in the early dark. The bookstore across the street, pulling its gate closed, the tailor's light going out, the yellow pools the street lamps made on the wet pavement. He spoke now and then about small things, easy things. The way that trees on this particular block had held their leaves later than usual this year. A baseball game Wendell had taken him to in August. Whether the bookstore across the street still stocked the kind of paperback mysteries he had been buying there for 25 years. He spoke the way someone leaves a lamp on in a room for a person who is recovering from something difficult, not to demand anything, only to keep the space from feeling entirely empty. Camille noticed that he was doing it. She did not say anything about it. It was the kindest thing he had done since the corner of Marshall, and she was not sure he knew he was doing it. Sylvia brought soup, then a plate of roasted chicken with potatoes and green beans that had been cooked in something that had taken time to become what it was. A glass of milk for Camille without being asked. Black coffee for Eugene. She refilled the bread basket once without comment and went back to her kitchen without asking either of them anything, moving through the small warm room the way she had moved through it for 37 years. Like a person who had decided that the people at her tables were her people and that her job was to feed them and leave them be. Halfway through the chicken, Camille set her fork down. She had eaten more in the last 20 minutes than she had eaten since yesterday morning. Her stomach, which had grown accustomed to less, was registering the change. She folded her hands in her lap and looked across the white tablecloth at the old man in the long gray coat. "Sir," she said, "may I ask you something?" "You may ask me anything," Eugene said. "Why are you doing this?" He set his coffee cup down carefully. The particular careful way of a man who had spent a long life around things that could break and had developed the habit of handling even simple objects as if they mattered. "That is a good question," he said. "It deserves an honest answer." He paused. He looked at his hands. "When I was 9 years old, I lived in a town in western Pennsylvania that does not exist anymore. The mill closed, and the town followed it. The way towns do when the one thing holding them together decides it is finished. My father had been gone for a long time by then. My mother was a seamstress. She took in mending for the families who still had a little money left, altering and repairing the good clothes they could not afford to replace. We did not have much. There were days, more than I like to remember, when I went to school hungry, and days when I came home from school hungrier still, because my mother had given me the only bread in the house for my lunch and had kept nothing for herself." He stopped, picked up the coffee, set it down without drinking. "One afternoon, I was walking home from school in November, cold like today, the same kind of cold that has decided to stay, and I passed a small grocery on the corner of our street, and I saw an old woman drop a sack of apples on the sidewalk outside. The sack had split. The apples rolled everywhere. She bent down to gather them and could not quite manage it. Her back wouldn't allow it. I was 9 years old. I was hungry enough that the smell of those apples on the cold pavement made me dizzy. And I had a choice, the way you had a choice this afternoon outside Marshall Foods. I could have taken one. I could have taken two and been gone before she straightened up, and she would not have known, and no one in the world would have blamed me." He looked at Camille very steadily. "I did not do that," he said. "I picked up every one of those apples and put them back in her arms and walked her to her door. Her name was Mrs. Beckett. She invited me in and gave me a bowl of stew that I can still taste if I close my eyes. She fed me supper twice a week for the next 4 years until I left for the city. She is the reason I am sitting here tonight. He let that land where it needed to land. You did for me today what I did for her a long time ago," he said quietly. "So I am doing for you what she did for me." Now, before we go any further, I want you to understand something moment Camille Broussard was sitting in. Because what happened on that corner of 8th and Marshall was not just a story of kindness. It was a story about a reality that millions of women in this country live inside every single day. There are approximately 15 million single mothers in the United States, nearly 1 in 3 lives below the federal poverty line. When a single mother loses her income, not through failure, not through poor choices, but through the simple collapse of a circumstance she could not have controlled, the average time before the system starts to come apart around her is between 2 and 4 weeks. 2 to 4 weeks before the rent notice arrives, before the food runs out, before the choices start eating each other. Camille Brewster was standing in week 3. She was not a statistic. She was a woman who had worked 7 years at something she was genuinely good at, who had a daughter who wrote her notes in red crayon, who had left the food in the apartment for Maya that morning without deciding to. That is not a failure of character. That is what a person looks like when the arithmetic does not add up no matter how carefully they arrange it. Her story is not rare. Her story is the story of women on corners you pass every day. The only thing that made this particular evening different was that one of them saw an old man who needed help and decided that his needing help was more important than everything else she was carrying. Now, let us get back to the table. Camille looked at the white tablecloth for a long time after Eugene finished speaking. The story had reached her in a place that did not yet have the right word for what it was feeling. She thought about a 9-year-old boy on a cold Pennsylvania sidewalk, choosing to give back what no one would have known he had taken. She thought about Mrs. Beckett, whoever she had been, who had opened her door to a hungry child and changed the shape of a life she could not possibly have foreseen. She thought about her mother in Birmingham, sitting at the kitchen table the summer Camille was 17, saying the things she said whenever the world made less sense than it should. The only way it gets better, baby, is when people decide to be the better part of it. Camille had heard that sentence 100 times. She was hearing it, for the first time, from the outside. Sir, she said finally, I don't know how to thank you for this. You don't have to, Eugene said. You already did, outside the store. Sylvia settled the bill at the counter in a way that Camille did not see and had not been meant to see. Eugene had a particular skill for handling money in a manner that removed it entirely from the emotional register of a meal. Not because he was careless with it, but because he had learned over a very long time that generosity announced to loudly stopped being generosity and became something else. He paid. It was done. The meal had simply been a meal between people who were eating together. Sylvia walked them to the door herself. She pressed Camille's hand once at the threshold, not the prolonged grip of someone making a moment out of a moment, but the brief, firm handshake of one working woman to another, the kind that says I see you without requiring anyone to say it out loud. Saturday, she said. The rye. Saturday, Camille said. Outside, the air had grown colder in the hour they had been inside. It had the particular sharpness of a November evening that is finished warming up for the day and means everything it says now, so. Wendell was waiting beside the car with the same demonstrative patience he had shown in the gravel lot near the lake, the patience of a man for whom waiting had become something close to its own form of occupation. He had the rear door open before they reached the sidewalk. Eugene paused before he got in. He turned to Camille on the sidewalk outside Sylvia's and looked at her the way he had been looking at things entire life, carefully, without rushing the conclusion, and he said, I am going to use him one more thing this evening, and I want you to understand that you are entirely free to say no. I will not be offended, and I will not think less of you for it. He paused. The house I live in is east of the city, past the suburbs, on a piece of land with old trees and a farmhouse that has more rooms in it than one old man has any sensible use for. There is a room on the second floor, and another across the hall from it, with clean beds and a bathroom of their own and doors that lock from the inside. Naomi, the woman whose name is on that card, lives in a cottage on the property and looks after the house. She has been doing so for 30 years. She is a grandmother 7 times over, and she is considerably kinder than I am, which is not a modest statement. He stopped. I would like to offer you and your daughter those 2 rooms for as long as you need them, while you find your footing, while you work out what comes next. You would not be a guest who has to earn her place. You and Maya would simply be people under my roof. You would be safe there. He said it without lowering his voice into a register that implied she needed to be handled. He said it the way he said most things, without decoration, because it was what he meant, and there was no reason to say anything other than what he meant. You may say no, he said. Wendell will take you wherever you ask him to go. But I am 78 years old, and I have learned, slowly and at some cost, that certain offers, when they come, so I am making this one plainly. Camille stood on the sidewalk outside Sylvia's restaurant in the cold November dark, with the eviction notice folded in her left coat pocket. She had been carrying it for 2 days. She knew its dimensions by now without taking it out. The exact width of the fold, the slight give of the paper where she had unfolded and refolded it twice, reading it again in case the words changed. Almost without thinking, she put her right hand into her right coat pocket. Her fingers found the card first. Eugene J. Harmon, the heavy white paper, exact and stiff. Then, beneath it, the note, soft from being folded and unfolded, the crayon slightly waxy under her fingertips. Mom, you're the best. She had not taken either of them out. She was simply holding both of them in the dark of her pocket, one in each finger, the card rigid and the note soft, and she stood there for a moment with her hand around both of them at once. She thought about Maya. She thought about the 6-year-old girl at Mrs. Patterson's apartment who was asking every 10 minutes when Mama was coming back, and who had pressed a piece of paper into her mother's hand that morning because something in her had understood, without having the words for it, that her mother needed something to carry. She thought about 2 rooms with clean beds. She thought about doors that locked from the inside. She thought about the ground disappearing on her feet for 3 weeks, and what it would feel like to stand on ground that was simply not doing that. My daughter's school, she said. Her voice was steady. She is at East Side Elementary. She has a routine. Naomi knows the route, Eugene said. She has driven children to school for 30 years. One more will not inconvenience her. Camille took her hand out of her pocket. Yes, sir, she said. Thank you. We would like that. Eugene nodded once, not with relief, not with satisfaction, but with the quiet acknowledgement of a man who had asked a plain question and received a plain answer and found the whole transaction exactly as it should be. Wendell, standing at the open rear door, made no expression at all. But something in his posture, something very small and barely visible, settled. The drive east of the city took longer than the drive to the restaurant. The street lamps gave way to porch lights, and the porch lights gave way to the long dark of countryside, where the only light was the moon on the bare November fields. Camille watched it happen through the window without saying anything. Eugene did not push her to say anything. Wendell drove with the same steady, unhurried patience he had shown all evening, and once, when Camille's eyes grew heavy in the warmth of the back seat, she caught herself and sat up straighter. And when she looked up, Wendell had already adjusted the heater 1 degree lower without being asked, which was how she understood he had noticed. The house, when they reached it, was not the kind of house she had imagined a man like Eugene Harmon would live in. She had imagined something imposing, something that announced itself from the road. What she saw instead was a long, low farmhouse made of pale stone with a slate roof and warm yellow light coming from the windows on the lower floor. There was a wreath on the front door made of dried wheat and a single dark red ribbon. The trees around the property were old oaks, bare now, their branches making a quiet architecture against the night sky. It was the kind of house that did not ask anything of you when you arrived at it. It simply stood there and let the light come through the windows and left the rest up to you. Naomi was waiting in the front hall. She was a small woman with iron gray hair cropped close and a face that had been kind for so long that the kindness had settled into the permanent geography of it, not the performed warmth of someone who had decided to seem kind, but the real thing, the kind that does not require any effort because it is simply what the face has become after a long time of meaning it. She did not make a fuss when they came through the door. She did not exclaim or reach out or ask questions that were really just ways of measuring what she was looking at. She looked at Camille directly, the same direct way Sylvia had looked at her, the same way Wendell had when he did her name, and she said, "Welcome. The rooms are made up. Are you tired?" Camille, who had not realized until that exact moment how tired she was, said yes. "Then let's get you settled," Naomi said. "There will be time for everything else in the morning." She led Camille up the stairs. The rooms were at the end of a short hallway, two of them side by side, with a bathroom between. The beds had white coverlets. The windows looked out at the dark fields and the old oak trees. The doors had locks, simple, ordinary locks, the kind you turned with your thumb, the kind that required no explanation. Camille stood in the doorway of the larger room and looked at the white coverlet and the dark window and the lock on the door, and she did not say anything for a long moment. "I'll bring a glass of water up," Naomi said from the hallway. "And there are extra blankets in the chest if the night gets cold." "Thank you," Camille said. "Get some sleep," Naomi said. "Maya will be here in the morning, and she is going to have questions about the kitchen. I should probably be rested for that." Camille looked at her. Something moved in her chest that did not have a clean name. Not quite relief, not quite gratitude, not quite the particular grief of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been permitted for the first time to set it down. Something in between all of those things. "How did you know she has questions about the kitchen?" Camille asked. "She is 6, Naomi said simply. "They always do," and she went back down the hall to get the water. The following morning, Wendell drove Camille back across the city to Mrs. Patterson's apartment. He did not make conversation on the drive. He drove the way he did everything, with a steady attention that did not require explanation. And when they arrived, he waited at the curb without being asked, engine running, while Camille went upstairs. Maya was at Mrs. Patterson's kitchen table, eating toast and explaining something about planets to Mrs. Patterson, who was listening with the expression of a woman who had not expected to learn about Saturn before 9 in the morning, but had decided it was not the worst way to start a day. When Maya saw her mother in the doorway, she came off the chair in one motion, crossed the kitchen at the particular speed of a 6-year-old who has been patient long enough, and pressed her face into Camille's coat. Camille held back of her daughter's head with one hand and did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Get your bag, baby. We are going somewhere." Maya had questions. She had them in the car, through the city, and all the way down the long road lined with old oak trees. She had questions about the farmhouse before she saw it and more once she did. But the negotiation, if it could be called that, ended in the front hallway when Naomi appeared, and Maya looked up at her and said, with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to soften an inquiry, "Do you know how to make biscuits?" Naomi considered the question with complete seriousness. "I have been making biscuits," she said, "for 53 years. I have opinions about the process." Maya took her hand. That was the entire negotiation. The winter at the farmhouse settled into a rhythm that Camille had not experienced in a long time, which was the rhythm of days that had enough in them without also having too much. Naomi drove Maya to school each morning in a car that smelled of cinnamon and old leather, and Maya came home each afternoon with drawings and questions and, once, a note from her teacher saying that Maya had given a presentation to the class about the moons of Jupiter that the teacher desk has, and she had quoted this directly, considerably more detailed than the curriculum required. Camille drove to work and came home and ate dinner at a table with other people in a warm room, which was something she had not realized she had been missing until the absence of it stopped. 3 weeks into the new year, a letter arrived addressed to her landlord. Not to Camille, but she learned of its contents through Naomi, who described it without being asked in the tone of a woman conveying information that was simply accurate and required no particular emphasis. A letter from an attorney explaining certain provisions of the Ohio Civil Tenancy Code as they pertain to the notice Camille had received, and suggesting that the landlord review his own documentation before proceeding further. The notice had been issued with an incorrect notification period. The debt had been recalculated. A check would follow. Camille called Naomi from the parking lot of the care facility where she had gone to pick up some paperwork and said, "I did not ask for this." "No," Naomi said. "I need to know who asked for it." A pause. "The money was always yours, Camille. It was sitting in a calculation someone had made incorrectly. Someone else just looked at the calculation and corrected it." Camille sat in the parking lot for a few minutes after she hung up. Then she went inside to get her paperwork. On a Thursday evening in February, she and Eugene were sitting in the front room after dinner, a room full of books and plain furniture, and the accumulated quiet of a house that had been lived in by one careful person for a long time. When Eugene set down his cup and said, "Tell me something about the work you did, not the logistics of it. What did your patients value most, in your experience?" Camille thought about it honestly. "Being called by their right name," she said. "Every day, not sweetie, not on, not you. Their name said correctly by someone who had learned it and kept it." She paused. "You would be surprised how many people stopped doing that after the first week." Eugene did not respond immediately. He sat with the answer for the length of a full minute. She counted it, not because she was impatient, but because she was curious whether he would actually let it sit that long. And then he nodded once. The nod of a man who had just filed something in a place he intended to return to. A week later, he mentioned, in the careful offhand manner he used when he was not certain how something would land, that he knew a director at a nonprofit on the East Side who ran community health outreach programs and was looking for a care coordinator. He could make a call if she liked. Camille looked at him across the dinner table. "I appreciate that," she said, "but I would rather find it myself." She said it without apology and without softening it. "If Naomi happened to mention my name to someone who mentioned it to someone else, I would not consider that the same thing as having it arranged for me." Eugene looked at her for a moment, the long, quiet look. "That," he said, "is a considerably better answer than I deserved." He picked up his coffee. "I will tell Naomi you said so." 3 weeks later, Naomi mentioned to Camille, in the kitchen, while Maya was asking about the correct ratio of butter to flour, which Naomi was explaining, with the patience of a woman who understood that some questions were also tests, that the director of a nonprofit on the East Side, a woman named Patrice, happened to be looking for a care coordinator. A good position, health coverage, reasonable hours. Camille applied on a Tuesday. She interviewed on a Thursday. She started the following Monday. She did not tell Eugene about the job until she had completed her first week. She told him over dinner on a Sunday evening in March, without particular drama, the way she told him most things. He said, "How is it?" She said, "It is good work. I know how to do it." He said, "Yes, I know you do." And that was the whole conversation. Spring came to the farmhouse the way spring came to places that had earned it, gradually, and then all at once. The bare oaks at the edge of the property put out leaves. Maya drew pictures of them with green crayon and taped the drawings to the window of her room. Camille paid the first month's rent on a two-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood with a park and a good school and a bus line that went downtown. She paid it herself, from her first full paycheck, and when she sat at the kitchen table at the farmhouse the evening before they moved and looked at the receipt, she felt something that was not pride exactly. Pride was too simple a word, but something adjacent to it, something that had to do with the specific satisfaction of a load, carried the right distance and set down at the right moment. She told Eugene they were moving the following Saturday. He nodded. "I expected nothing less," he said, and turned back to his book. She kept coming back on Sunday evenings when Eugene was well enough, and Naomi made the biscuits Maya had developed professional opinions about. Eugene and Camille talked in the long, unhurried way of people who had stopped needing to prove anything to each other. He disagreed with her sometimes and said so directly, which she valued more than agreement from someone who was being careful with her. Maya asked Eugene about the oak trees on one of those evenings, what kind they were, how old, why some of them leaned toward the light and some grew straight. And he answered every question with the complete seriousness he brought to questions he considered important, which was all of them, and Maya listened to every answer with the complete seriousness she brought to questions she considered important, which was also all of them. And Camille sat in the corner of the front room and watched the two of them and did not say anything. On the drive home that night, with Maya asleep against the window, Wendell said nothing for the first 15 minutes. Then quietly, as if he were making a note to himself rather than speaking to anyone in particular, "She is going to be all right, you know, both of them." Camille looked out the window at the highway lights. "I know," she said. Wendell nodded and drove. The years that followed moved the way years do when you are inside them, not in a straight line but in layers, each one settling over the last until the earlier ones became something you carried rather than something you could point to. Camille's work at the nonprofit grew from care coordinator to program director over 3 years. Maya started middle school and developed, in rapid succession, strong opinions about biology, the designated hitter rule baseball, and the correct way to fold a fitted sheet, which she had learned from Naomi, and which Camille was fairly certain Naomi had taught her specifically as a gift to the argument. Life became something Camille recognized again. Not easy, recognizable. Through all of it, she watched Eugene the way she had learned to watch people whose bodies had begun to renegotiate the terms of their arrangement with the world. She had done it for 7 years as a professional. She knew what to look for. She saw the cane doing more of the work at the farmhouse than it had when she arrived. She saw his gestures becoming smaller, more deliberate. She noticed that he had moved his favorite chair, the reading chair in the study, to face the east window rather than the bookshelf, which was the chair of a man adjusting the angle of his view. She did not say anything about what she noticed, neither did he. She visited him twice the year. The trees around the farmhouse were more beautiful than she had ever seen them. Once in June, when the light through the oaks made everything look like an old painting of itself, and once in October when the leaves had gone the color of old copper in the sky behind them, was the particular deep blue of autumn afternoons that were already thinking about winter. On the June visit, Eugene was thinner than he had been at Christmas. He moved through the lower rooms of the house with the same deliberateness, the cane doing more and his gestures smaller. He made no mention of any of it, and Camille did not ask. Because she knew from a long time of sitting beside people, in the difficult middle of things, that sometimes the most important kindness was simply to continue the conversation you had already been having. On the October visit, Naomi held the front door open in a particular way when they arrived, not wider than usual, just held for a moment longer than necessary. And Camille understood without being told what the gesture was saying. Eugene was in the chair by the east window. He had a blanket across his knees and his hands folded on top of it. He was thinner again. The silver of his hair was the same. His eyes were the same pale, clear blue, and when Camille sat in the chair beside him, they found her face with the same quiet directness they always had. Maya went to the kitchen with Naomi. They could hear her voice from there, some question about the soup, something about thyme versus rosemary, delivered with the authority of a 13-year-old who had been studying this kitchen for years. Eugene and Camille talked for a while about things that were not the things they were talking about. The October cold, the book she was reading, whether the book's postcorner still carried the fabric mysteries he had been buying there for 30 years. Then he set his coffee down on the small table beside the chair and turned to look at her directly. "What do you think about building, Camille?" he said. "Not work, not the program, building." She had known the question was coming, the way you know certain things before they arrive. She had been thinking about the answer for longer than she would have said if he had asked her how long. "Something for women like me," she said. "Women who are standing in week 3 and don't have anyone who can hold the door open long enough for them to get through. Not charity. Not a program with a waiting list and a form that makes you explain how desperate you are before anyone will look at you. Just ground that is not disappearing. Time to stand still, a door that locks from the inside." Eugene was quiet. "It would need to be small at first," Camille said. "Real before it was large. I have seen what happens when things grow before they know what they are." "Where would you put it?" "East Cleveland," she said without hesitation. "Close enough to the people who need it to be useful. Not so far from what I thought I stopped being able to see it clearly." Eugene nodded. "What would you call it?" Camille looked out the east window at the copper trees against the October blue. "I don't know yet," she said. A pause. Outside, the nearest oak moved in the wind, and the light through it shifted. Mrs. Beckett, Eugene said, was the kindest person I ever met who did not know she was kind. She did not make a decision to change a life. She fed a hungry boy because he was there, and she had stew and the thing seemed obvious to her. She never knew what came of it. He looked at the window. There are names that are bigger than the people they belong to. Names that have more work left in them than the person who carried them had time to do. This could be one of those names. Camille looked at him. If you find it fitting, he said, you do not need my permission. I'll think about it, Camille said, which meant, and both of them understood it to mean, that she had already decided. Eugene died that December, quietly, without announcement, in the small stone farmhouse, with Naoma holding his hand and the room very still. Camille was sitting in the chair beside the bed, reading aloud from a book he had given her 2 years earlier, a collection of essays by a writer whose sentences, he had told her, when he pressed it into her hands, took you somewhere and left you somewhere different, which was the only thing worth reading for. She had been reading for perhaps 40 minutes when she became aware of a different quality in the silence and looked up. Naomi, on the other side of the bed, shook her head very gently. Maya was asleep on the sofa in the front room, her coat still on, one arm thrown over her face the way she had been sleeping since she was small. The will was administered the following January. It ran to many pages in the way that wills do, when a man has spent a long life building things and has thought carefully about where each of them should go when he is finished. Near the end, in the section his attorney had marked for Camille's attention, there was a trust. It was designated specifically and in plain language for what the document called Camille Broussard's Community Housing Initiative, and the amount in it was enough to find a building and do what needed doing to it and open its doors and keep them open long enough to know whether the thing was real, which Camille had already decided it was. There was also a letter. Her name on the outside in a hand she recognized, steady, spare, unhurried. She opened it at the kitchen table that night, after Maya was in bed, at 1:15 in the morning, with a cup of tea she had made and not yet touched. The letter was short. Dear Ms. Broussard, 3 things. The first is that your daughter is exactly like you, which means she is going to be fine, and so are you. The second is that you carried my groceries when no one else on that corner would stop, and you did it without looking around to see who was watching, which is the only way it counts. The third is that the world gets better only when people decide to be the better part of it. And you, Camille Broussard, were the better part of mine. EJH, she read it twice, she read it a third time. Then she folded it along its original creases. She reached into her coat pocket, the good coat, the one she kept by the door, and took out the note. She had moved it from coat to coat for years without deciding to. It was soft now, the paper almost cloth at the fold lines, the red crayon slightly faded. 6 years old. Red crayon, slightly wrong spelling. She placed the letter and the note side by side on the kitchen table. She sat with both of them in the quiet of the apartment at 1 in the morning, the city making its usual sounds outside, Maya asleep down the hall. She looked at the 2 pieces of paper for a long time, one written by a 78-year-old man in a house east of the city, one written by a 6-year-old girl at a kitchen table before school. Between them on the white surface of the kitchen table, everything that mattered. She picked up the tea. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway. Camille Broussard is 46 years old now. Beckett House sits on Huff Avenue in East Cleveland, 3 blocks from the corner of 8th and Marshall, in a building that spent 11 years empty before Cuz attorney found the owner and negotiated a price. The building is 2 stories of old brick that had been painted over so many times the original color was anyone's guess. Camille had it stripped back and repainted the color of pale stone. Not because it resembled anything in particular, but because it was a color that did not demand anything of you when you looked at it. The sign above the door is not large. It says in plain letters on a dark background, Beckett House. Below the name in smaller type, a place to stand still. What Beckett House does is not complicated to explain. It finds women, most of them raising children alone, most of them somewhere between week 2 and week 4 of a crisis that the world around them has not yet decided to notice. And it offers them what Eugene Harmon offered Camille on a sidewalk outside Sylvia's restaurant on Larchmere Boulevard. A season to stand still. Safe housing for as long as the season requires. Legal support for the notices and the debts and the paperwork that accumulates when a life starts coming apart at the load-bearing points. Connection to work, real work. Not the kind that asks you to be grateful for being paid too little to afford the child care you need to show up for it. And time. The specific, undervalued, almost impossible to find commodity of time in which to work out what comes next without losing everything while you look. The doors lock from the inside. This is not incidental. It is in the founding documents. In the 9 years since it opened, Beckett House has served 231 women and 318 children. Camille knows this number not because she keeps it as a metric, but because she knows every name in it, or has tried to, which is a different thing and one she considers part of the work. Maya is 18 years old. She volunteers at Beckett House on Saturday mornings before her shift at the biology research lab, where she has been working since last spring. And she is good at it in the particular way that people are good at things they have been preparing for without knowing it. She is leaving for Columbus in August, a full scholarship to Ohio State biology, with ideas about medicine that she delivers without being asked and defends with an energy that Camille recognizes from the mirror and from the memory of a 6-year-old explaining the moons of Jupiter to an old man who answered every question with the seriousness it deserved. She will be fine. Camille has always known this. She knows it differently now. A journalist from the Cleveland Plain Dealer came to Beckett House on a Wednesday afternoon in October to write about what she called community-anchored institutions. She was thorough, and she asked good questions, most of which Camille answered directly. At the end of the interview, she looked up from her notes and said, "Why Beckett House? Who was Mrs. Beckett?" Camille was quiet for a moment, not the pause of someone arranging an answer. The pause of someone deciding how much of the true one to give, and then deciding, as she had been deciding things for 12 years now, to give all of it. There was a woman in western Pennsylvania, she said, who lived on a street corner where a small grocery used to be. A long time ago, before any of this existed, a 9-year-old boy saw her drop a sack of apples on the sidewalk one cold afternoon in November. He was hungry enough the smell of those apples on the pavement almost made him dizzy. He picked up every one of them and put them back in her arms and walked her to her door. Her name was Mrs. Beckett. Camille looked out the window at Huff Avenue in the October afternoon. She invited him in and gave him a bowl of stew. She fed him supper twice a week for 4 years after that. She never knew what she had put in motion. She died before any of it became anything she could have pointed to. The journalist wrote this down. Then she looked up. Who did he become? Camille picked up her coffee. She held it for a moment. Someone who still stopped for people, she said, even when the whole world was walking past. She did not say his name. Some things belong where they began. The story of how Beckett House came to exist was never a news story. There were no cameras on the corner of 8th and Marshall on the Tuesday afternoon in November when Camille Broussard stepped forward for a stranger whose bag was about to tear. There was no one filming when Eugene Harmon gave her a small white card with a name and a number on it and told her she did not have to explain anything. The story stayed where it began, between the two of them, the way the most important stories always do. Passed on not through headlines, but through what one person builds, because of what another person chose to do on a cold sidewalk in a city that was not watching. It is a Tuesday morning in November. Camille locks the front door of Beckett House at 8:30 after the last of the overnight residents has left for the day. Most of them to work, one of them to a job interview she has been preparing for since August. The November air meets her at the door with the same directness it has always had in this neighborhood. She turns up her collar. She walks to her car. She drives north on Huff Avenue. At the intersection of 8th Street, she turns right, and at the corner of 8th and Marshall, she does not drive past. She stops, she puts the car in park and gets out and stands on the sidewalk on the corner of 8th and Marshall with the November wind off Lake Erie in the morning light, the flat gray of a Cleveland winter that has made up its mind. Marshall Foods is still there, 43 years of operation, the electronic bell above the door still chiming its slightly flat chime for whoever is coming through. A woman comes out with a plastic bag and turns east without looking up. A man goes in. The door closes. The bell sounds. Camille stands on the pavement exactly where she stood 12 years ago, with $43 in her account and an eviction notice in her left coat pocket and a 6-year-old girl's note in her right one. She does not take either hand out of her pockets. She does not need to. She knows what is in them. She stands there long enough to know it, long enough to let the knowing be specific rather than general, not just that something happened here, but what it was, and what it cost, and what it became. Then she gets back in the car. There is work to do. The story of what happened on this corner was never told publicly. There were no security cameras on 8th and Marshall that afternoon. No one in East Cleveland knew that one of the wealthiest men in the Midwest had walked out of a family grocery store and let a tired woman carry his bag through the cold for 6 blocks. The story stayed quiet, the way the most important ones do, living not in headlines but in the thing Camille built because of it, in the doors that lock from the inside, and the women who sleep behind them, and the children who wake up in rooms with clean sheets and eat breakfast before school. If this story found you today, I want you to do one thing before you close this video. Go Go to the comments right now and tell me where you are watching from. It does not matter if it is Cleveland or a city I've never mentioned. It does not matter if it is early morning or past midnight. Every comment tells me this story reached someone it was meant to reach, and that is worth more than any number I could track. Tell me what part stayed with you. Was it the corner of 8th and Marshall? Was it the card with a name and a number and no explanation attached? Was it Naomi at the front door saying, "Are you tired?" without asking anything else? Was it the letter with three things? The particular three things Eugene Harmon chose out of everything he could have said? Was it Mrs. Beckett herself, the woman in Pennsylvania who fed a hungry boy twice a week for 4 years and never knew, not once, what she had set in motion? Whatever it was, write it down. I read every one of them, everyone. If you are new here, the subscribe button is below this video and it costs you nothing. The stories on this channel are not about famous people. They are not about dramatic rescues or moments that went viral. They are about corners and kitchens and cold sidewalks and the choices that nobody records. The ones people make anyway, because something in them has decided that being the kind of person who keeps walking is not who the story's worth telling. Those are the ones I will keep telling, as long as you keep showing up to hear them. One last thing, and then I will let you go. Camille Broussard stopped for a stranger on a Tuesday afternoon in November because a bag was about to tear. That is the whole beginning. What came after? Beckett House, 231 women, 318 children, every door that locks from the inside, all of it came from that one decision made in a moment when she had every reason not to make it. There is someone watching this right now who is standing at their own corner of 8th and Marshall. I do not know what is in their pockets. I do not know what the arithmetic looks like. But I know this: the world gets better only when people decide to be the better part of it. You already know which kind of person you are. Subscribe, leave a comment, and come back for the next one. Thank you for being here.